Nicholas Cherry never believed in chance. Every step, every decision, every move in business he thought out in advance, sometimes even several steps ahead. Over the decades that he spent on creating his empire, he managed to build a real kingdom, a chain of restaurants, hotels, entertainment complexes, and several huge shopping centers around the world. His business flourished, and he himself was one of the richest and most famous people on the planet. But despite all this fame and financial independence, Nicholas felt that something important was missing in his life. Just a few years ago he would have laughed derisively at anyone who told him that happiness required more than just money and success. But now that he had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of, it was clear to him that behind all those accomplishments there was nothing he could be proud of in front of him. He realized that behind wealth, fame, and popularity lies loneliness. Until a few years ago, Nicholas believed that his family would be his support, his reliable rear. And although his wife left him before the children grew up, he naively hoped that his children would be different. But as time went on, he began to realize that they were not so much interested in him as a person as in his money. Nicholas couldn't say it out loud, but he felt it every time one of his children called or visited him. They didn't ask how he was feeling. They didn't talk about the past or the future. Instead, they started the conversation by saying they needed more money for a new business or how nice it would be if he invested in their startup. Oscar, his oldest son, who had recently returned to the U.S. after living in Europe for several years, was a true representative of this new generation for whom financial success was the meaning and purpose of everything. He was not a bad man, but he clearly believed that money was everything. And while he was very attentive to his father, helping with his father's business and even showing up at family gatherings on occasion, behind it all was a desire to squeeze as much profit out of Nicholas as possible. Nicholas saw this, though he tried to ignore it. He loved his son, of course, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was always a distance between them that was hard to overcome. Oscar never wondered if his father was happy, if he was in a good mood. Everything came down to business, opportunities for its expansion, prospects. And this saddened Nicholas, although he repeatedly tried to reassure himself that this is the price of success. Anya, his only daughter, was no less ambitious. She had been married for a long time and had asked her father more than once for financial help to buy new homes and start new businesses. She was just as attentive, but her concern was always more correct than sincere. She didn't ask direct questions, nor was she intrusive, but you could sense between the lines that her interest in her father was limited solely to his opportunities. Nicholas had seen her grow up, becoming more independent, but it was still hard for her to imagine her life without her father's financial support. Nicholas loved them, but increasingly realized that they didn't know who he really was. Their relationship with him was superficial, even if not always explicit. And what surprised him most was that this attitude became more and more obvious with each passing year. They came to him not to talk, but to discuss opportunities, projects, business ideas. And each time, Nicholas could sense that they wanted only one thing: more money. Yes, they often spoke of their respect for him, but it was more of a courtesy than a sincere desire to know how he was feeling, what was going on in his life. With each passing year, Nicholas realized more and more that he had become less of a father to his children and more of a mere source of funds. He didn't want to complain or blame them, but it was frustrating nonetheless. He was willing to help them if they really needed help, but he could no longer ignore that conscious coldness that came between them every time they met. It had become a staple of his life. He had become the object to whom the children came only for material support. And so, at this point, when everything was predictable and clear, Nicholas began to think about what he would leave his children as an inheritance. He realized that for him it was not just a matter of distributing his fortune, it was something deeper and more important. He could leave them his businesses, continue the family business, but he realized that this would not bring them what they really needed. And what did they need? He wanted them to realize that the real value of life wasn't in the money, but in the relationships he'd never been able to build with them. I want them to realize that money isn't everything, he thought as he sat in his office. He stared at a photograph on the wall that showed old France, where he had started out in business when he was still young and full of ambition. At that moment it became clear to him, he had to make a change. He couldn't leave such an inheritance to his children, because that would only continue the same soulless pursuit of wealth. Nicholas decided he needed to do more than just transfer assets. He needed to leave them not money, but values that they had never learned to appreciate. Nicholas sat in his office, staring out the window at the vast expanse of the country estate. The wind rustled the leaves quietly, but there was a storm in his soul. He thought over and over again about his decision, which would probably be a turning point in his family's life. He had realized a lot in recent years, reevaluated a lot. He knew that changing his relationship with his children would be difficult, that everything he had built would be empty unless he made a real connection with them. At first he thought he could just give away his businesses to them, but then he realized that would only make them more dependent on his wealth. And that conclusion was a real revelation to him. He didn't want to continue living in the shadow of his empire. He didn't want his children to see him in the future only as a means to enrich themselves. He wanted them to understand the importance of relationships and not just strive for material wealth. In that moment, Nicholas realized that if he truly wanted to change their lives, he had to leave them not with money, but with the life lessons they had ignored for so long. His thoughts went back to the moments when he and his wife were just starting to build their lives. They were young, enthusiastic, and dreamed of making the world a better place, creating something great and making a mark in history. But somehow gradually their dreams were eclipsed by the desire for success. Money became the main goal and then the way to maintain that success. Nicholas now felt how much he had lost by forgetting his true values. However, he still believed that not all was lost. He knew that if he decided to take the big step, his children could understand his intentions. But in order to do so, he needed to act decisively. He decided that he had to make adjustments to his will. This decision didn't come to him immediately, and he spent a long time thinking about exactly how to do this so that they would not only feel responsible, but also begin to develop on their own without expecting him to provide a constant financial boost. In his will, Nicholas intended to exclude those businesses and assets that had brought him wealth, leaving his children only what could teach them about real life, not the material side of life. He knew that it was unlikely they would understand him immediately, that they would probably resent the decision greatly, but he also knew it would be the right thing to do. Not everyone he knew could understand such an act. But he was prepared to face their outrage. Nicholas felt that this change would be a real test for his children. He realized that they would look for support in their usual social circle, would try to manipulate the situation and find a way to get things back on track. But he also knew that if they were left without that handkerchief, the financial backstop, they would be forced to face reality and begin to develop their own strength. With each passing day, Nicholas felt more and more that this step was necessary. He wanted them to realize the importance of their own efforts, that no one in life would get everything on a silver platter. It was an important decision not only for his children, but also for himself. He felt that he could finally free himself from the weight of the constant feeling that his life and his wealth were not the result of labor, but something given once and for all. He picked up the piece of paper again and began to write down his thoughts. This was not just a decision, it was a message he had to leave behind. He knew that his children would probably not be happy about it, that they would probably feel betrayed. But he also realized that if he did nothing, if he didn't change their lives, they would never be able to appreciate what really mattered. He wasn't going to leave them with just money. He wanted them to become self-reliant, to develop themselves as individuals, not just live off his success. Nicholas took a deep breath, letting his thoughts go blank. He knew that when he put his decisions in the hands of a lawyer, his children would start looking for ways to appeal the will. It was inevitable that they would. But it didn't matter to him how they would react. The important thing he knew was that he was doing the right thing. The plan was almost ready. He decided to leave them only those assets that could teach them how to work, build their own businesses, seek opportunities, and overcome challenges. The land where his estate stood, a few old paintings and historical artifacts were what he was going to pass on to his children. These things, in his opinion, were far more valuable than all his real estate, than his entire fortune. They were symbols of what they were to go through in life. The first steps he had to take were to go over his will with his lawyer and then meet with his children. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He had a premonition of how they would react, and his heart told him their reaction would be violent. But he wasn't scared. He wasn't afraid because he realized that this move would give them a chance to change their lives. He knew that no one could give them more than their own experience. And when the moment came to talk to the children, Nicholas felt the tension that had been building up in his soul come out. He gathered them all together in the house that stood on his country estate. He could have said it anywhere, but it was here, among those stately walls and exquisite paintings, that he wanted to tell them what he was about to do. He realized it would not be a simple conversation. And perhaps he was right. This was war. Nicholas Cherry was a man who had dedicated his entire life to creating something great. He knew how it was. Nothing is impossible for someone who is willing to toil and sacrifice. His journey from a poor student to one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world was full of struggles, mistakes and victories. But despite all his achievements, Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that he had felt more and more in recent years. When he was young, his family was the foundation of everything for him. Love, respect, close relationships, that's what he considered the main meaning of life. But with each passing year, his children became more and more distant. He began to notice that they began to see him not as a father, but as a source of funds that they could use for their own needs. Anxiety began to build, but Nicholas didn't want to admit it for a long time. He tried to think that this was the way life worked. Money, success, and business always put a man in a position of leadership, and everyone around him tends to utilize his resources. As his children grew older, however, he began to notice that their interest in him wasn't about how he was feeling or what was going on in his life. More and more often, they started the conversation with questions about money. His oldest son Oscar, who had returned to America after living in Europe for a long time, always started with the fact that he needed to find investors for a new project, rather than asking how he was doing or how he was feeling. He talked about his business ideas with such passion that it seemed as if money was the only thing he cared about. "Dad, you can help, right?" was how their conversations began. Oscar never said directly that he needed more money, but his manner of speaking always left that impression. Nicholas tried to ignore it, but each time he did, he felt that their connection was becoming more and more superficial. He tried to talk himself into believing that it was normal for children to want to carry on his business, that it was part of their growing up, but something inside told him it wasn't about business. Anya, his daughter, was no exception either. Her husband had long ago proposed the idea of creating another startup, and Anya often asked her father for support. She would ask how things were going in his companies, never missing an opportunity to ask if they could allocate funds for their new project. She wasn't as persistent as Oscar, but her requests were of the same nature: money and the possibility of getting it. "Dad, you always say it's important to support loved ones, don't you? Maybe we could work together?" Anya's phrase always stayed in Nicholas's mind. He knew her words were not about helping him, but about him helping her and her husband. In her eyes he saw not respect for his experience, not a desire to build something bigger, but just another request for financial support. As much as he tried to justify them, Nicholas began to realize that his children don't value him as a person. They don't turn to him to talk about life, they don't inquire about his condition, health, or thoughts. They only turn to him for money. They don't notice his pain, they don't notice his need. He was just a bank account for them to fill in their financial gaps. Each time Nicholas became more and more irritated. His inner conflict grew stronger and stronger. He didn't want to be only a source of funding for his children. He had always believed that a family should be more than just an arrangement of mutual benefits. And despite all his success, he felt his life had no meaning if his children couldn't see him as a person, but just another asset to be utilized. "I don't want to be just a wallet," he often thought, closing his eyes and trying to find solace in the silence of the night. "I need to make a difference. They shouldn't have to live in this bubble, they need to realize that there are things more important than money. Why can't they see me as a human being? Why have I become nothing but an ATM machine to them?" Soon his thoughts turned to more concrete actions. He realized that he couldn't make them change just with words. He knew that if he did nothing, things would continue to go on like this. He could no longer allow his children to remain in this illusory world where money decided everything. He knew he had to intervene, and intervene drastically. One evening when the whole family was gathered at their country home, Nicholas decided to talk to the children. He felt that the moment of truth had arrived, the moment to lay everything on the table. His heart beat faster as he thought about this conversation. This was the moment that would probably change everything. He was prepared for them not to understand him, for them to be hurt and disappointed, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood up when everyone was gathered in the living room and looked at his children. Oscar, as always, was the first to break the silence. "Dad, we have a new project here. We want to get into some startups and we need to invest. You've always said that growth is important, development. You'll help, right?" Nicholas felt his tension reaching its limit. This was the moment when he had to decide whether he would remain just a silent observer in his children's lives or take a step that would possibly change their perceptions. Nicholas stood in the living room looking at his children and realized that this moment was crucial. He could feel the tension in the air building. Oscar waited impatiently for an answer, his eyes glistening with anticipation, as if everything had already been decided, and only the signing of the contract was missing. Anya sat silently in the chair, watching her father's every move. She, as always, knew how not to show her real emotions, but Nicholas knew that she was waiting for the yes, too. There was something hidden in her eyes, not love or concern, but rather calculation. And that feeling was becoming more and more apparent to him. "Dad, you realize it's a bargain, don't you?" Oscar spoke again, his voice a little more insistent. "Everybody does it. We just want you to help us. You've always been the one to take the risks and take us to the next level. You're not going to say no, are you?" Nicholas felt his blood run cold. With every word Oscar said, he felt more and more that his children looked to him not as a father, but as a source of unlimited resources to provide for them. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but everything inside him was screaming with indignation. How could they be like this? Couldn't they see that it didn't really matter? He had always believed that money was a tool, not a goal, but now it seemed that they perceived him solely through that prism. He glanced at Anya, but her face didn't express the slightest sympathy either. She sat with a neutral expression, but his intuition told him that her thoughts were not on family values, but on how to get what she wanted more quickly and profitably. "I thought you'd finally start to realize that there's more to life than just money," Nicholas said, trying to speak in a calm voice, but he was seething inside. "I've always loved and supported you, but I don't think you understand me. You don't look at me as a human being, but as a means of profit." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Oscar fell silent, and Anya averted her gaze. But Nicholas could see how she was at that moment trying to adjust to the situation, how her mind was trying to process what he had said. "Are you serious?" Oscar finally said, his tone becoming aggressive. "We're just asking you to help. You've always been there for us when we needed it. You once said family was the most important thing, and now you're saying everything you've done for us is a mistake? Do you want us to become like all these mediocre people who don't know how to get back on their feet?" Nicholas knew that his words would be taken exactly that way, as a betrayal. His son didn't understand what he really meant to say. Oscar was looking for excuses for his own weakness so he wouldn't take responsibility for his actions. Nicholas felt that he couldn't stay silent any longer. "I want you to be independent," he said firmly, his voice sounding full of confidence. "I want you to learn to be independent, not to continue to depend on my wealth. Money doesn't solve everything. I cannot and will not ensure your success unless you fight for your dreams yourself." Oscar squirmed and his face reddened with anger. "So you're just giving up on us?" he exclaimed. "Can't you see that we're doing everything we can to further your cause? It's not like just asking for money. This is a chance you're missing, not realizing that we're not just your children, but the continuation of your legacy." "I won't continue my legacy as you see it," Nicholas replied. "I want you to build your own lives. I'm willing to help you, but not with money or investments. I want you to find your own way, not sit on my path." That's when Anya finally intervened. You've always been like this, Daddy." Her voice was cold, but there was resentment in it. We work, we try to build on your legacy, and you tell us it's not what you want? You want us to start from scratch? Are you out of your mind?" Nicholas sighed, feeling the internal conflict intensify. It was a difficult decision, and he knew his children wouldn't understand it right away. But he was ready for it. He could no longer live with the illusion that his relationship with them was anything more than financial dependence. He knew their reaction would be painful, but it was a necessary evil. "I don't want you to start from scratch," he said, trying to remain calm. "But I do want you to realize that true wealth is not what you have in your account. It's what's inside of you. I can't give you happiness, and I can't give you independence unless you want it for yourself." Silence filled the room. Oscar looked stunned, and Anya was angry. She stood up and went to the door. "You don't understand, Papa," she said without turning around. "We're all here because we want to continue your work. And if you don't support us, that's your problem, not ours. We have to live with it." Nicholas felt his heart clench. This was exactly what he had feared. He thought he could explain to them that they had to find their own value, but they didn't seem ready to understand that. They weren't ready to give up financial dependence and stand on their own 2 feet. At this point, Nicholas realized that his children had never learned to appreciate him as a person. They didn't want to build their own lives, they wanted to continue using his accomplishments without making the effort to do something themselves. It was a hard blow for him. He realized that he couldn't change them right away. They might need to go through pain to learn to understand the true value of life. But Nicholas was willing to endure that pain to give them a chance. The process that began as a decision to help his children became a harsh reality for Nicholas. He increasingly realized that his relationship with his children was not what he had hoped for. He was willing to sacrifice his fortune, his business for them to understand the importance of independence and effort. But instead he faced their refusal to understand his point of view, their resentment and frustration. After Anya and Oscar left the house, Nicholas was alone in his room, trying to cope with the emotions that came in waves. He could feel his inner world crumbling. Everything he had built seemed to have no meaning now. He had invested his entire life into this business, but now realized that his children didn't understand the true value of what he had accomplished. They didn't see him as a father who wanted the best for them, only a resource to capitalize on. At this point, Nicholas came to the conclusion that if he wanted them to change, he needed to act drastically. He couldn't just give up and leave things as they were. He decided that this conversation with the children must not end here. It was time for action, and that action required drastic steps. "They may not understand me," he pondered aloud, "but I can't keep supporting them in their illusions. I cannot be a mere ATM for them. They must learn to live on their own, even though they are too used to easy money." Nicholas thought about the future. He realized that the decision he was about to make could have strong consequences. He didn't want to leave his children all of his assets like before. He didn't want them to continue living in their closed world where money decided everything. He decided that he would leave them only things that could teach them real-life values. He began working on new stipulations in his will. At first he planned to pass his companies on to his children, but after his last conversation with them, he realized that this would only make the problem worse. If he handed everything over to them, they would continue to build their lives only on the basis of material wealth rather than their own effort and fulfillment. He decided that he should leave them only those things that would make them become self-reliant. Nicholas thought about what to leave his children as an inheritance. He was not going to leave them money, but the opportunity to self-actualize, gain experience, and learn how to work. He thought about giving them some of the land on which his country house was located, as well as old paintings that he had once bought in Europe. These things, in his opinion, were more valuable than any asset because they were connected to his life and his truth, to what he had always valued. He decided it was a good time to talk to a lawyer. He had to make changes to his will, which meant that his children would have to face the consequences of his decision. He knew they would not be happy. It was inevitable that they would be. But he also knew that in the long run their lives could change for the better if he allowed them to grow up on their own rather than continue to depend on his money. In the evening, a few days after he had spoken to the children for the last time, Nicholas gathered them in the house again. This time he was determined. He knew he had to take a decisive step that would change their relationship forever. "I've made a decision," he said as everyone gathered in the living room. "It concerns what I will leave you as an inheritance." Oscar was again the first to speak. "Are you crazy?" His voice was full of bewilderment and indignation. "You want to deprive us of everything? You didn't even think that we were building your legacy?" "We're your children, Daddy." Nicholas sighed. He knew this was going to hurt, but he couldn't back down. He looked at Oscar and replied, "I don't want to deprive you of everything, Oscar. I want you to learn to be self-reliant. I will leave you some land, some paintings and ancient artifacts. But I won't leave you the business. I don't want you to continue to live off my success. I want you to find your own way." Anya listened silently, but her face was contorted with anger. She couldn't believe that her father was willing to do this to them. "It's not normal," she said, her voice tense and cold. "We're working on this together. Are you going to destroy everything?" "I'm not destroying, I'm freeing you," Nicholas replied. "You won't learn to appreciate what you have if you continue to live under the illusion that money is the solution to everything. I want you to become what you are, not what I made you." The silence that hung in the room was heavy. Oscar and Anya were silent, but Nicholas could see the realization slowly appear on their faces that their lives were changing. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. He knew it would take time for them to realize that he hadn't done this to betray them, but to give them a chance at independence. "Dad," Oscar said, "you have to realize that we can't start from scratch. You've seen how much effort we've put into your projects. Do you want us to lose everything you've created?" Nicholas sighed. He knew they wouldn't understand him right away. But he believed that, in time, they would learn to look at life differently. "No," he said, "I don't want you to lose everything. But I want you to find your own value. It will be hard, but that's how you can become strong and independent." His words left a sense of incomprehension in the air, but Nicholas knew it was necessary. He could no longer afford to be just a source of money. He had to give his children a chance to realize that there were some things money couldn't buy. Nicholas Cherry thought for a long time before making his final decision. He knew it would be abrupt and painful, but it was the kind of move he believed could bring his children back to the realization that there were more important things in life than money. He needed to change their perceptions, to make them see the world differently. He was willing to put everything on the line, but it was the only way he could fix their attitudes toward him and toward life. After Nicholas had discussed his intentions with the children one last time, he resolutely set about changing the will. He realized that it would be a hard road not only for him, but also for Oscar and Anya. They were adults, they were successful in their businesses, but he felt they lacked depth, an understanding of the true values of life. He had to help them realize that happiness was not about money, but about family, about relationships, about how you perceive the world and yourself in it. Every time Nicholas looked wistfully at his bank account, which went over billions, his mind blocked. He realized that all that money was just numbers on a screen. They would bring no joy or meaning unless they were invested in what really mattered. It was this money, which had always been the source of his success, that was now the cause of his frustration. He decided to leave his children not businesses, not real estate, but those things that would help them build their own lives. He was going to give them some of the land in the country house, old paintings and artifacts that were real treasures to him, not just expensive objects. These things could teach them to appreciate art, nature, and ultimately life itself. Nicholas also knew that his decision would not be understood immediately. He foresaw a violent reaction, especially from Oscar, who had already begun to make his ambitious plans based on the family capital. But Nicholas was firmly convinced that, despite all the difficulties, this decision would help his children grow as individuals. They had to learn to appreciate hard work, effort, and not expect everything to be served on a silver platter. The process of preparing the will was long and thorough. Nicholas met with the lawyers several times, clarifying details, making changes. But every word, every detail was difficult for him. He knew that this was a decisive moment, on which depended not only his own perception of life, but also the future of his children. When the will was ready, he finally dared to call his children. It was an important and, he thought, painful event. He realized that their lives could change dramatically and it would not be a simple process. He felt like their relationship with him would probably be destroyed, but perhaps this was the right step. Understanding comes through experience, not pretty words. As Oscar and Anya gathered in his father's study, Nicholas began to speak. I have decided to change my will. I will not leave you all my assets as I had planned before. Nicholas' words hung in the air, and in his eyes you could see the seriousness with which he approached this decision. Oscar, as Nicholas expected, was the first to react. What do you mean? His voice sounded worried, with a sense of anxiety in it. Are you out of your mind? Do you want to leave us without everything? Nicholas replied calmly, though his heart was beating faster. No, I will not leave you without everything, but you must realize that happiness is not in money, not in businesses and investments. I will leave you some land, some paintings and artifacts, but I will not hand over my companies to you. You must learn to be independent. I want you to find your own way, not to rely on me and my money, but to build your own lives. Oscar turned pale and looked at Anya, as if expecting her to confirm that this was all a mistake. But Anya was silent, her gaze more aloof. Do you realize that you're ruining us? We were doing everything we could to continue your business. Oscar intervened again. Have you ever thought of the fact that we are your children? Why can't you support us like any normal parent? Nicholas felt the pain building up in his chest. He had always thought that his children would understand him, that they would be able to see opportunity rather than punishment behind his decision. But their words only confirmed his fears. They didn't see him as a human being, they only saw him as a means to their ends. I can't continue to support you in this, Nicholas replied, trying to keep his emotions in check. You have to become independent. You have to go through difficulties to realize what is really important in life. Oscar and Anya looked at each other. Their faces expressed anger and bewilderment. This was the first stage of their reaction, shock and displeasure. They couldn't believe that their father, who had always been a pillar of support for them, was now taking away everything they were so used to. Anya jumped up from her seat and went to the door. This is crazy, she said in a cold voice. You betrayed us. We did everything we could to make you proud of us. Now you want to take everything away from us? Nicholas felt that phrase sink into his heart. He knew they wouldn't understand his decision right away. He knew they would need time to get over the shock. But he was sure it was necessary for their future. He wanted them to realize that the world didn't revolve around money and power. When Anya and Oscar left, Nicholas was alone in his room. He realized that he had made the right decision. Yes, it was painful, but it was the only way he could help them find their way. He was willing to go through with it, even if he had to endure the isolation and alienation from his children. He knew now that it would be an important lesson for them, and they would be able to appreciate what he had done someday. The decision-making process was agonizing for Nicholas. He knew that the consequences of his action could be disastrous, yet he had no doubt that this step was necessary. The children did not understand him, and he realized that from the beginning his words would be perceived as a cruel blow. However, deep down he believed that someday they would realize how important this decision was. Several days had passed since he had told the children of his intentions. Throughout this period, Nicholas had felt his life enter a new phase, a phase in which he was no longer just a businessman and a source of financial stability for his family. He was now a man who had decided to make drastic changes to give his children back not just material things, but their own dignity and ability to make their own lives. Time passed, but the children's reaction remained the same. Oscar, as Nicholas expected, had not forgiven him. He no longer tried to hide his emotions and openly stated his disappointment. He didn't call or try to mend the relationship. It was hard for him to understand that his father could make such a decision. He still felt it was Nicholas' responsibility to support their ambitions and secure their financial future. But it was this moment that was crucial for Oscar, the moment when he realized that his father would no longer support him for nothing. He had to find his own way. Anya, on the other hand, was less frank. She kept silent, avoided meeting her father, and said that everything that had happened was a mistake. She tried to establish contact with him, but after a few days her behavior became even more aloof. Nicholas knew that she didn't immediately realize how important this decision was for her development. But deep down, he believed that someday she would realize that his goal was not to punish them, but to help them become independent. Throughout these days, Nicholas was in a state of internal struggle. He didn't know if he had done the right thing. He felt how much his heart ached because his children were so hurt by his decisions. But on the other hand, he knew this was their chance, a chance to learn to be strong and independent. He prayed that they would understand him later, that they would be able to grow up and realize the true values of life that he was trying to pass on to them. One such evening, as Nicholas sat at his desk, his thoughts went back to the moment he made the decision to change his will. He remembered how hard it had been for him to take that step, but at the same time, he couldn't leave things as they were. He knew that his children were somewhat under the illusion that money and power were all they needed. But he realized that by leaving everything to them, he would only exacerbate their dependence on his wealth. He couldn't just be a source of money for them. He was their father, and he wanted them to become real people, not just continuers of his business. After a few weeks, Nicholas made the decision to meet with the children again. It was a difficult meeting, and he realized that they were still full of resentment. But he knew that if he didn't act now, they would never be able to understand his decision. When Oscar and Anya arrived at his house, Nicholas felt a wave of pain rise again in his soul. He knew this meeting would be difficult, but he couldn't back down from his words. "I hope you understand why I did what I did," he began, trying to speak calmly. "I didn't mean to offend you, but I want you to be independent. It's not just a matter of money, it's a matter of values. You have to learn to be independent, and to do that you have to go through hardships." Oscar was the first to speak again, his face expressing pain and anger. "You don't understand. You don't see how hard it is for us right now. We could have continued your business, but you ruined everything. You're making us start from scratch when we had a chance to be part of your success." Anya couldn't hide her disappointment. "You made us realize that you don't love us anymore. You want us to suffer, to go your way despite everything we've done for you." Nicholas felt his heart clench. He couldn't hide his pain, but still, despite it, he continued. "I don't want you to suffer, I want you to learn to truly live. You can do anything you want without my help. I leave you with everything you need to grow and become strong. I want you to realize that happiness and success is not something that can be bought." The silence in the room grew even thicker. Oscar and Anya stood in front of him, but they couldn't understand his words. They didn't know how to accept the decision Nicholas had made. This was the moment when they were forced to face the truth that they needed to learn how to be successful themselves. It was a moment and they realized that their father would no longer support them in their pursuit of money. But Nicholas knew this was just the beginning. He realized that his children wouldn't be able to understand him right away, that it would take time. But he believed that eventually they would understand. Only through hardship, only through independent effort can one truly achieve success and happiness. When Nicholas told his children about his decision to change his will, he knew that it would cause a storm of emotions. But he never imagined how violently they would react to his move. He hadn't expected that his children, whom he had always thought of as mature and independent people, would be so unprepared for this turnaround. He was sure they would be able to understand that he was not doing this out of spite, but because he wanted them to learn to appreciate what was truly important in life. However, instead of understanding his motives, they began to show every sign of seeing his decision as a personal betrayal. A few days after Nicholas announced his intentions to the children, Oscar and Anya reappeared at his house. Oscar was the first to step into his father's study, his face pale with anger and his eyes burning with rage. Anya seemed to be much more composed at this time, but there was no usual smile on her face either. "Are you out of your mind? Oscar began, ignoring the greeting. Are you really depriving us of everything? How could you? We're your children. You always said that family was the most important thing to you. So why are you doing what you're doing now? Nicholas knew they would be furious, but his heart still clenched when he saw their reaction. Oscar was like a storm, he didn't know how to react to the change that Nicholas had brought into their lives. Anya, sitting next to her brother, looked wary, her gaze was focused and the silence only added to the tension. You don't realize what this means for us. You could have left us everything. Your companies, your fortune, your assets. You betrayed us, Oscar continued, his voice growing more and more desperate. Nicholas felt the tension in the room rise. He had long ago gotten used to the power of emotions, but now his own children couldn't make the decision he thought was the only right one. He knew they needed time, but there was no way they could understand it. Oscar was right, he was part of their lives, part of their well-being. But it was this moment, Nicholas thought, that would be the turning point when they would begin to value relationships, not money. I know this is difficult for you, Nicholas said, trying to speak calmly, but I want you to understand that life is not just about business and money. I can't be just a source of income for you. I want you to become independent. You have to learn how to build your own life. Oscar, not hearing back what he expected, leaned toward his father and said with icy contempt. Do you really think we'll be grateful for this? You're leaving us empty-handed, making us start from scratch. Do you realize how much you're giving us with this decision? Anya, who had been silent until now, finally intervened. She looked at Nicholas with eyes full of bewilderment and pain. Dad, we have always been by your side, we helped you build this business, supported you. And now you're saying we don't deserve anything? You see how hard we've worked. Why can't you support us? Why are you doing this to us? Nicholas felt his shoulders shrink under the weight of this conversation. He knew these questions came from pain and frustration, but he was sure he had to do it for their own good. He was trying to convey to them that money wasn't everything, that their bond had to be built on something more valuable. I can't continue to support you the way I have, he replied, trying to keep control of himself. I want you to find your own way, to overcome your own difficulties. That doesn't mean I'm leaving you. It means I'm giving you a chance to be who you need to be. Oscar couldn't take it anymore and exploded, an anger in his voice that he couldn't hide. That's mean, Dad. You knew perfectly well that this was a disaster for us. You always said we were your pride, that you wanted to see us succeed. But now you're robbing us of everything we could have built. You've ruined our dreams, you've ruined our world. Anya stood up and walked towards the door, her steps were firm but at the same time there was something of desperation in her movements. I can't take it anymore, she said over her shoulder. You don't realize that we built on your foundations, and now it's all crumbling. We can't live without it. You leave us no choice. Nicholas sat back in his chair, holding back his emotions. He knew they didn't understand him, that they couldn't understand right away. But he also knew that this was the only way. He couldn't keep feeding them illusions any longer. He knew he had to give them this chance, this challenge. And though their words were painful, he was willing to endure the pain for the sake of their future. After they left, Nicholas was left alone. He felt a heaviness in his chest, but at the same time he realized that this was a necessary step. He knew that his children might never be able to fully understand his motives, but deep down he believed that in time they would realize that it was this gesture that would help them become who they were meant to be. The decision-making process and its consequences for Nicholas was an important moment not only for him, but also for his children. After Oscar and Anya left his home, Nicholas felt his life change once again. He knew that this moment would have long-lasting effects on his relationship with his children, but at that moment, he couldn't afford to doubt his decision. His actions, though seemingly cruel, were intended to give them a chance to survive in the real world, without the constant reliance on his success and wealth. After days of silence and conflict, Oscar and Anya realized that they could not force their father to change his mind. But they were too proud to admit their failure. Instead, they began to act more cunningly, trying to manipulate the situation by drawing attention to themselves through other means. Each day spent without a shift in their relationship only added oil to the fire of their frustration. Oscar continued to try to appeal to his family. He began reaching out to friends and business partners to create pressure on his father. He confessed that he was worried about his future career and that Nicholas's decision hit not only his own ambitions, but the entire team he worked with. "Don't you realize that we're just trying to carry on your work, Dad?" Oscar used to say when he could get away to see his father. "It's not just our wish. We've been building all this for years. You can't just take everything we've done and destroy it." Nicholas met such statements with complete calmness, although inside his emotions were raging. He knew that Oscar was still stubborn, and his relentless attempts to promote his cause and convince his father to give back everything he had were becoming more and more insistent. But Nicholas wouldn't let himself give up. "I understand that it's hard for you," he said, trying to be as restrained as possible. "But I can't let you go on with the old pattern. You can't just rely on my accomplishments. You must find your own way, your own goals. That is the meaning of life." Anya, for her part, began to approach the situation more cautiously. She didn't yell, she didn't resent it, but her behavior became more and more wary and manipulative. She made several requests to her father for counseling, emphasizing how difficult it would be for her without financial assistance. "Dad, I understand your intentions," she once said in a quiet conversation. "But you can't just take away everything we've worked so hard to build. You can see that my husband and I have ambitions, too. I know you want us to be independent, but you can't be so cruel." Nicholas, after listening to her, sighed and said, "Anya, do you think I am cruel to you? I'm not cruel, I want to help you become strong. Life is not just about collecting money and achievements. It is much more complex and deeper than that. I don't want you to continue to live in a bubble where everything is given to you for nothing. You need to learn to appreciate what you can do for yourself." But Anya didn't accept his words. Her gaze became even more alienated, and she began calling him more and more often, trying to get back at least some of what she had before. She sought from him not only financial help, but also moral support, but Nicholas remained adamant. "Dad, you don't understand. You and I talked about plans, about the future, and now you're ruining everything." She continued to insist, but Nicholas saw in her eyes only a weak attempt to manipulate his feelings. And so, after weeks of desperate attempts to regain what was lost, Oscar and Anya decided it was time to resort to more drastic methods. They began sharing their frustrations with friends and business partners and explaining that Nicholas had treated them unfairly. This tactic proved quite effective in the context of their social circle. Soon, other members of their social network found out about the change of will, and the tension around the situation became even stronger. This pressure soon took its toll. Oscar, increasingly angry and determined, invited Nicholas to a private meeting that would finally decide the fate of their relationship. He had prepared in advance arguments full of emotion and accusations. When Nicholas arrived at the meeting, he immediately felt that the atmosphere was tense. Oscar sat at the table, clenched his hands into fists, his gaze was full of determination. "You ruined our lives, Dad," Oscar began, not hiding his anger. "I can't understand why you did this to us. You've always been our mentor, but now you're walking away and leaving us with nothing. You can't make us believe you're doing the right thing." Nicholas, despite his son's rage, remained calm. "I didn't ruin your lives, Oscar. I've given you everything I can. But you have to realize that you can't go on like this. If I don't intervene, you'll never learn independence. I can't let you continue to live off me." Oscar didn't expect such an answer. He felt that his manipulations hadn't worked, and his inner despair only increased. "You're cruel," he said bitterly. "We didn't ask for much. We asked for your support, and you're taking everything away from us." Several months passed after Nicholas made his decisive move. He watched his children face the consequences of him changing his will. These months had been hard on Oscar and Anya, and although they both tried to give the appearance that they were coping, the reality was that their lives had changed dramatically. Without the financial backing of their father, they were forced to learn how to live for real by confronting what really mattered. Oscar, who had always been assured of success thanks to his father's support, now found himself in a difficult situation. His ambitious projects, which he had built on the family capital, began to crumble. Business partners began to lose interest and they realized that there was no additional funding from Nicholas. All of his plans built on his father's investments and money began to fall apart. His first attempts to get support from other investors were unsuccessful. Oscar had been trying to publicize his startups for a long time, but he increasingly realized that without the resources and authority of his old name, he simply could not achieve anything. He desperately sought help from friends and acquaintances, but no one was willing to take the risk. With each passing day he felt his world shrinking and the bar of ambition that he had soaring so high with began to fall. At first it depressed him. Oscar couldn't believe that he had so easily lost everything he had relied on. But gradually, over the course of a few months, he began to change. He found old friends who had once been his partners, but at that point they weren't connected to his business or money. These people helped him a little, but most importantly, they didn't offer him ready-made solutions. They made him think and act on his own. Oscar began to look for new sources of income on his own, start small businesses and develop ideas that he could have realized without his father's help. He faced a difficulty he had never experienced before. He was forced to work from scratch, without any guarantee of success. But it was through these difficulties that he began to realize that money doesn't solve everything. Some time later, in one of his conversations with a friend, he confessed, "I always thought that money and connections were the most important thing. That if you had the resources, you could get anything you wanted. And now that I don't have them, I realize that I know nothing about real business. I thought all that mattered was success, not what you build or who you do it with." His friend, smiling, replied, "Exactly. Money can help, but it doesn't solve all problems. They may be a temporary solution, but only real relationships, trust and a willingness to work on yourself can bring real success." Oscar didn't immediately realize that these were exactly the words he had been missing. He began to realize that happiness is not about money, and that a person who can achieve success on his own, without outside help, is much more valuable than someone who has always relied on others. Anya, for her part, also faced her own difficulties. She and her husband were trying to launch a new business, but without her father's financial support, they soon realized that they would have to start from scratch. It was a painful process, and Anya couldn't understand why her father did what he did to them. She called him often, trying to negotiate for him to at least partially bring them back to the way they were. But Nicholas remained adamant. At first Anya was embittered. She felt that her father had betrayed her. He had been her rock, and now it seemed that everything she had was destroyed. She was worried that their family was no longer the same. But gradually, after months of struggle, she began to reconsider. One evening, sitting with her husband, she said, "I think everything we've been through helps us realize that what matters most is not money. We always thought it was the only thing that determined our success. And now we're faced with the fact that we have to build it all back up again. It's a hard road, but it's ours. And I'm starting to believe that's what really matters." Her husband, who has always been supportive, responded, "Yes, it is. We can start again, and it will probably be a lot harder, but we'll be proud of it ourselves." Anya and Oscar began to change. These difficulties taught them to work for themselves, to build their own lives. They began to realize that what really matters is not what you get, but what you create yourself. It was a painful process, and they still didn't understand everything at once. But gradually, through small successes and failures, they began to develop confidence in themselves and their abilities. A few months later, in one of his meetings with his father, Oscar said, "I was wrong, Dad. For a long time I didn't understand why you did it. But now I see that you gave us a chance. It's hard, but it's become clear to me that real success comes when you find your own way. You give us nothing but opportunity. And that's what matters." Anya added, "I realized too that it is more important what you have given us than what you might leave behind. We would have wanted you to help, but now I realize that you didn't give us money, you gave us the opportunity to become what we should be. That's more important than anything else. Nicholas, as he listened to them, felt the weight off his shoulders. He knew this process wasn't easy, but he had faith that his children could learn to appreciate real values. And they did. It had been over a year since Nicholas had changed his will and decided to cut his usual ties to money. Oscar and Anya, after going through hardships and feeling the full consequences of their actions, finally began to realize that their father had done the right thing. Although the process was painful, they each learned lessons that impacted their lives. Oscar was getting deeper and deeper into his own business. He stopped relying on his father's resources and started building his company from scratch. It was difficult, and not everything worked out right away, but Oscar became more confident. He learned to work within constraints and find solutions that previously seemed impossible. Each month his project became more and more successful, and despite the difficulties, he felt that he had achieved something meaningful. Oscar learned to appreciate not only the money, but also the effort that went into any success. Anya, for her part, also began to work on herself. She and her husband started a new business that didn't involve the money she used to get from her father. She learned to take risks, make decisions, and not be afraid of failure. All of this led to her life beginning to be filled with confidence and self-esteem. She finally realized that her father wasn't trying to ruin their lives, but instead was trying to help them become strong. As Oscar and Anya began to achieve success, their relationship with their father began to change. Months passed and they both realized that their father was right. He had given them not just money, but the opportunity to realize that real value lay not in material things, but in personal growth, in relationships, and in the fact that they could create their own path. One day, after months of intense but productive negotiations with partners, Oscar called his father and asked to meet. Anya was also among those who decided to meet with Nicholas. It was an important moment for the whole family, and they all realized that it was time for a final meeting. As everyone gathered at Nicholas' house, he immediately felt a change in the air. They were all different, more confident, calmer, but most importantly, they were open to conversation. Oscar, Anya and Nicholas were sitting around the large table in the living room, and it was obvious that there was no longer the estrangement between them that there had been before. "Dad," Oscar began, his voice calm and confident, "I want to thank you. We didn't understand at the time why you did what you did, but now I know it was the right thing to do. You taught us things we could not have learned otherwise. We're no longer dependent on your money. And I'm proud that I can work without your support." Anya added, "I want to thank you too, Dad. You were right. I often thought you wanted to punish us, but now I realize that you wanted to give us a chance. I now know what it means to be independent, and I am proud that my husband and I can create our own future without help." Nicholas sat listening to them and could not hide his sense of satisfaction. He realized that his children had come a long way, but now they were ready to move forward without looking back. They had learned to appreciate what was really important, and it was a victory worth all the effort. "I'm proud of you," Nicholas said, his voice full of emotion. "I always believed that you were capable of more, and now I see that you have not just learned how to work, but have become better as individuals. That is the most important thing I could give you." At that moment, the whole family felt united. There were no more resentments, no more painful conversations. Everyone realized that this process was necessary for them to become who they were. Nicholas knew that he had made the right choice, and although the path had not been easy, he was confident that his children could now create their own futures. Although Oscar and Anya were still going forward with their businesses, there was no longer a dependence on money between them now. It was the realization that each person had to find their own path, no matter what resource they had. And this moment became their catharsis, a moment of purification, when they let go of the past and began to build the present on new principles. When the meeting was over, Oscar and Anya stood up and walked over to their father. They hugged him, and Nicholas felt all the tension go away. It was the moment of completion of their journey, the moment of realizing that what matters most is love, relationships, and the ability to support each other. "We won't disappoint you," Anya said, her voice sincere. We now realize that you have done something much more important for us than just money. You gave us a chance to be ourselves. Oscar added. And we promise that we will work hard, build our lives, and appreciate everything you've taught us. Nicholas looked at his children and realized that despite all the hardships, this path had led them to what he had longed for. He was confident that their future would be bright because they had learned to appreciate what really mattered. It was the moment their transformation was complete, a moment that brought not only satisfaction but a deep inner peace. The family had reconnected, and they were ready to move on, together, but as independent individuals who realized that what matters in life is not money, but how we treat each other and the relationships we build. Thank you for walking this journey with the characters in this story. I hope this story about the power of family, forgiveness, and new beginnings has inspired you and reminded you of the importance of support and love even in the most difficult times. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your impressions and comments. Your thoughts and feedback are very important and inspire new stories. Subscribe and give us a like so we don't miss new stories. I apologize for any errors in the text. Thank you for your understanding and support.